video that we have to see, that we will be seeing. Now, before I start, I want us to go to chapter 14 of Exodus, verse 10. Come on in. No. No, in Sunday school you don't have to sit in your row, but then when church starts, then you have to then you have to move to it. 13 verse 10, and I'm not going to give 14 verse 10. I'm not going to give much explanation of this, but to say that this was a theme verse for the people that we're going to hear about, a theme verse for them as they reflected on what had happened in their life, what was happening in their life. And this is where the Israelites have finally escaped Pharaoh, but now they find themselves between a rock and a hard place, between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. Verse 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die here in the desert. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring to you. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Let's enter the story of Volendam.
Refugees are people whose motivation for movement is fear. To get away from. Of course, they also care for where they get to. But that's the secondary question.
As kids, I don't think we realized the intensity of the danger.
Wir hatten nur Stillsitzen gelernt, überall. Aus Angst still sein hier und da und überall.
Man ist immer gehemmt. Man muss aufpassen, was man sagt, was man denkt. Die Gedanken, die gehen sogar.
Stalin did it.
The whole time we were fleeing from the Russians. And this meant to us Mennonites, we were going to be free.
For Joseph Stalin, 1947 was a year to celebrate. Over the past 2 decades, he had consolidated his power over the Soviet Empire while overseeing a massive social and economic overhaul. After being nearly defeated in 1942, with the German army just miles outside of Moscow, the Soviet army would rally. Despite costing the lives of 20 million Soviet citizens, the Soviet army and the industry behind it had become an almost unstoppable force, rolling through Germany. The Big Three had won the war, but Stalin had taken the ultimate war trophy in the German capital of Berlin. His relationship with the West, however, had gone cold. The Americans' presence in Europe countered the Soviet army, and Berlin, now divided by the Allied victors, had become a source of constant friction between the two emerging superpowers. There was also a refugee problem, spread throughout Germany and Western Europe, where masses of Soviet citizens some had been taken as slave labor during the war, but many had fled west with the retreating German army, desperate to escape Stalin.
Stalin wanted all his people back, and that included soldiers, included Cossacks, German Lutherans, German Catholics. He wanted Mennonites. He definitely thought that they were traitors to the homeland and that they should be punished for that.
The war is over, and these Mennonites are hiding in Europe. If they're found, they're going to be shipped back to Russia.
Into labor camps. They weren't allowed to go back to where Mennonites had originally lived.
Women, children, elderly were just sent out into the gulags, into the forced labor camps, and forced to work.
After World War II, there's thousands of Mennonites trapped in refugee camps in Holland, in Germany, and a large group in Berlin.
American-administered section of Berlin with the Russian zone around them, a refugee situation of folks who are very afraid.
The events that would follow would make international headlines, involving countless aid workers, the Soviet and American high commands, and even a queen. But to understand the story of how these Mennonite refugees from the Soviet Union got there in the first place, and why they were so desperate to never return, you need to go back in time. 3 decades earlier, in Ukraine region of the Russian Empire, is where their story begins. The Mennonites living there were part of the larger religious movement that had originated in Holland centuries earlier, as followers of the former Catholic priest, Menno Simons. They believed in adult baptism over child baptism, and were pacifists, strongly believing in nonviolence.
At its core, there's a belief in following Jesus as the example, nonviolence.
They also spoke the German and Plautdeutsch, or Low German, languages.
And because the Bible was translated into German, as well as German hymn books, that became a central anchor point for them. They wouldn't be ethnically German. They do now speak German.
These Mennonites were originally drawn to Ukraine as a place free of religious persecution, with exemption from military service. But after a century of peace and prosperity, everything would change.
So in 1914, when the war began, there were probably about 120,000 Mennonites in Russia, Ukraine.
They were pacifists, but allowed to do non-combat roles to support the larger effort.
Mennonite men did alternative service, either working in the forests or working as medics on hospital trains.
As the war progressed, the Mennonite colonies would find themselves occupied by the German Imperial Army.
There was a cultural connection because of the shared language.
Russia was in the midst of fighting Germany, but would plunge into a series of crippling revolutions, ending with the Communist Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, forcing a peace with Germany.
1918, the war came to an end. Germany had to withdraw. There was no good government.
Anarchy would overtake Ukraine. Led by the notorious bandit Nestor Makhno, the Mennonite colonies would then endure pillaging and murder at the hands of his bandits.
MAKHNOVSKY, who was not communist, but he was an anarchist.
It was a big debate how to respond, and some finally did respond by creating a self-defense unit.
So much chaos in South Russia, the war, then there was the revolution, then there was civil war with red and white armies battling each other and crossing.
Front went through the Mennonite areas time and time again.
The Red Army finally prevails, pushes MAKHNO out, and MAKHNO flees. And the Soviet Union becomes a new entity, a new government in Russia.
And then the famine hits.
It was a combination of drought. It also resulted from the Soviets confiscating a lot of grain, seed, food, draft animals, and so on.
The Mennonites in Russia then decide they have to do something. They can't survive there. And so they send a delegation to North America to ask for aid, and also to help for immigration.
There was a meeting in the summer of 1920 in Elkhart, Indiana, that brought together representatives of numerous different Mennonite groups in North America.
The Mennonites in Ukraine, they were desperate. They reached out to their religious cousins. Some of them had close connections in Canada, others were more distant in the United States.
There were other Mennonites, part of the larger movement in Europe, that centuries earlier had migrated to Pennsylvania, the American Midwest, and Ontario, Canada. There was also a group directly related on the Canadian prairies who had come from Ukraine only 50 years earlier. They were known as the KANADIER.
In the 1860s, the military exemption is threatened, and they have to teach government curriculum in the schools in Russia. Some of the Mennonites in Russia figure this is not what we want. About a third of the Mennonites left Russia at that time.
These groups in Ukraine, the United States, and Canada had never worked together. But the four young men representing the Ukrainian Mennonites facing famine would change everything.
They insisted you have to work together. You have to create something central that will respond to this need.
So out of that emerged this organization that is called the Mennonite Central Committee. And the very first thing was they went down the road from Elkhart, Indiana, where that meeting was, to the Mennonite College in the little town of Goshen, Indiana, and they found 3 young men who were students at Goshen College, and their task was to go to southern Russia, Ukraine, and verify that the story that they heard was indeed true.
And they saw a lot of need.
Women by the railroad tracks literally kneeling down, picking every little bit of grain that fell from the train cars as they trundled through their towns. Hitched as the draft animals in the plowing equipment so that they could farm.
The Mennonite community started counting food and shipping food to the Ukraine to alleviate the shortage of food there. Setting up food kitchens for not just Mennonites, but for everybody.
And then after the food was sent, sending a replacement for horsepower in the form of Fords and tractors. There were other organizations doing similar work, so there were other folks helping other Russians, other Mennonites, but the Mennonite Central Committee, this newly formed organization, was among those responding to the need in Russia.
Lenin establishes a new order, and it looks for a number of years as though things are maybe going to get better. But that's also when the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization in Canada arranges for immigration.
The Mennonites who came to Canada in the 1870s, they showed the government they were good farmers, they were good citizens. And that sets the stage for the immigration in 1923.
Almost 20,000 Mennonites transported to Canada.
It was a very difficult time for people to decide if they're going to leave. Many families are torn.
They stay because they feel as if there is a future there. Some stay because they don't have any opportunities. Some stay because of family reasons. They want to remain close to them, and they think that they can negotiate with the Soviet government and figure out how to live under this new system.
Then Lenin died, and there was a power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky. The emigration ceases, and from then on, Mennonites really know that they're going to be in trouble.
In 1929, a very desperate group of people, German Lutherans and Catholics and others, including Mennonites, thousands of them, they moved en masse to Moscow.
They called it an emigration panic. And when the people here in America, especially in Canada, became aware of this, and they realized how grim it actually was becoming.
Canada was not accepting any more Mennonites at that time either. And it was the German government that said, we'll take these people and we'll help them resettle elsewhere.
There were no countries willing to take the Mennonites that were stranded in Moscow, with one exception. Just a few years earlier, a group of the Canadier from the Canadian prairies had been frustrated with the Manitoba government's involvement in their schools. They wanted autonomy, so they moved to Paraguay.
Because the government was infringing on their rights to educate their children as they saw fit. The government said, sure, you can come to Paraguay, you can have your schools, religious freedom, but you gotta go to the Chaco, you gotta go to a place where there is not settlement, you gotta start over.
The Chaco was dry, hot, and had never been farmed. Nevertheless, some 1,700 Mennonites from Canada would establish a colony there. In 1929, they're joined by the group of 1,000 who had fled to Moscow.
Some Mennonites got out and got to Paraguay, but after that the border was shut. They were at the mercy of Stalin.
He believed that there was something called capitalist encirclement of the Soviet Union. It was not just the struggle between armies in the field, it was also the struggle between economies. The Soviet Union has to modernize.
Isolated and lacking capital to embark on his ambitious plans, Stalin saw the peasant farmers as his solution. The collectivization had begun.
Basically, peasantry would be expropriated. We'll have to subsidize the development of modern factories, modern industries in the Russian cities.
You gave up your farms, you gave your implements, you gave up your homes to the collective. And Mennonites were part of that.
Ukrainians strongly object to collectivization.
To create collective farms, they had to get rid of the peasant resistance.
Anyone who had been a more prosperous farmer, and almost all Mennonites would have been included in that category, was labeled a kulak, somebody who was a resistor, a counter-revolutionary.
In Ukraine, also in Kazakhstan and other areas of the Soviet Union, grain will be requisitioned from the villages and the people won't have enough to live.
The Holodomor was an attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian people and their opposition to collectivization. And you eliminate enough people that the rest will be cowed.
For Ukraine, the most reliable estimates are almost 4 million people who died from starvation in 1932-33.
I still remember the NKVD came and searched the whole house. They knocked on the walls, and then they found it right. And I was standing beside my dad, and then he said, "You will give 1 pail for Stalin."
Die Leute, die mussten fast verhungern. Und dann, wir gingen dann zur Schule. Und meine Schwester und ich, wir waren so elendig, wir bekamen jeder ein halbes Liter Milch, dann haben wir Wasser rein. Und so haben wir überlebt als Familie.
Spring came, we was going in the field, and there was kind of a grass that we could eat. That we took and ate it.
Mennonites were in part sheltered from the hardship because they had connections with North America, with Germany.
In fact, essentially the only thing that they were able to do after that point was send relief packages and money. It was a bit of a fraught situation because the packages could be looted.
It was the Stalinist era and a very dark time for the church. My father, he was elected as a minister until the church was closed and all ministerial activity became impossible.
Wurde Papa, Mama hat nachher, durfte ja vorher nichts sagen, mit glühenden Nadeln unter die Nägel gespickt und sollte den Glauben absagen. Und dann kam wieder frei, aber sollte nicht mehr predigen. Papa sagte, ich muss Gott mehr gehorchen als den Menschen. Und dann ging wieder und predigte.
The Bolshevik Revolution was based on the principle that religion is bad. It's an opiate of the people, based on a long history of oppression in Russia. And the church had been very complicit with the powers of the day, the czars, in oppressing the peasants. When Lenin came to power, he disenfranchised the church. And then when Stalin came to power, he was even much more brutal. The anti-religious crusade that he embarked on was not directed at Mennonites. It was directed at every church.
There was nothing religious going on. There were no church services to attend. There were no Mennonite gatherings. Well, they couldn't aggravate the situation. It was bad enough as it was.
Wir durften ja keinen Glauben dann haben. Und viele, sogar von unseren Mennoniten, gingen dann ums Haus und horchten abends, ob die Kinder beteten oder nicht, die Eltern mit den Kindern.
Also man ist keinmal frei, man weiß nicht von wem, ob vom Bruder, vom Nachbarn, vom Freund bespitzelt wird.
Jeder hat am Montag wieder spielen. Die Leute dem dann verklogen oder gesehen für den Geld.
Our Mennonite teacher, she had to ask whether our family celebrated Easter, a great church festival, or Christmas, and she was to report that.
Denn ich erinnere mich noch, wie mein Großvater, wie ich auf dem Schoß bei ihm saß und er erzählte mir die biblischen Geschichten. Und seine Töchter, sie waren 2 Tanten von meiner, wohnten mit ihm zusammen, die waren so schrecklich unruhig, die hatten Angst, die würden sie nach Sibirien schicken.
In the mid-1930s, Stalin becomes very paranoid and has a number of major purges.
He thought that ends justified means in this case.
And KVD, that's the Russian abbreviation. They took people away. The mothers, they were asked, whom have they taken? They had seen the black car in our village. And the black car, that was the one that the people disappeared, the men, Black Raven.
Father was arrested in 1935. I never saw him again.
My father's name was Isaac. He was seen by someone in one of the concentration camps, but probably didn't survive much after that.
My dad was actually taken in 1937, and my mother was pregnant with me. So then she was left with 6 kids.
I remember very well going to school, everything was fine. I thought we had a good life. One day the KGB came, opened the door wide, and he said, now I have to go too, because many fathers had been taken away already. 8 cousins stood and cried until we saw our fathers loaded onto a half-ton truck, never to be seen again.
Einfach Nacht kam die GPU mit Gewehr, schlugen an die Tür, aufmachen und zum Mann einpacken, mitgehen, auf Nimmerwiedersehen.
The mayor from our town came and knocked on the window and said, open the door. And My father says to my mom right away, no, they are here. That's the end. And sure it was.
We always said, they were taken forever. And none of them came back.
Most of them were shot a few days after their arrest.
So during the Great Terror, almost 1 million people, right, over 800,000 executed in 1936, 1938. But you have even greater number of people sent to the Gulag.
Just short of 500 major camps in which people were sent to work.
Located in all kinds of inhospitable places. More than 5 million people, convicts, working essentially for free as slave labor for the state in those labor camps.
My father was arrested. I was 11 years old. There was between my sister and myself 5 years difference. We were sent to Siberia. We had no beds. The shell of the potatoes, baking them and cooking them, that was our food. Otherwise, we didn't have the food. Father died. We didn't have a funeral, nothing. My mother, she asked me, do we have a crust of bread? And I said, no. Then she said, mein Kind, not leg dich hin und schlaf. So that's what I did beside her. And in the morning, I realized she had died. So early in the morning, my sister said, okay, now let's go to escape. So we walked for 3 days. And my sister said, which house do we knock on the door for help? And the lady opened the door and we asked for help. And she said, come on in. Went with a truck to the station where the train from Moscow. We found my aunt, and there I stayed for 10 years. And my aunt, she became my mother. She took care of me.
We had been totally isolated from world news. Otherwise, the news available to us were broadcast from loudspeakers somewhere in a public place and were totally the news of the state.
They took all the men from 16 to 60. Nobody see them again.
Oh, they would say, the Germans were coming, the Germans were coming. And in the night, the German planes were bombarding. We had orders to organize, and we were on the way to Siberia. And then the Germans started shooting.
I think the closest shell fell maybe about 30 meters or so from our shelter.
The machine gun stopped and it was quiet, very quiet. And then after a little while, there was a big bang.
The hydro dam had been blown up. We could hear the waters rush 5 kilometers away. And apparently thousands were swept away by this destruction of the dam.
And all of a sudden we see 3 men coming, machine gun and all that. It was with German soldiers. And they came passing by. Ja, guten Morgen. Was? Ich spreche Deutsch? Ah, ja.
came to the back door in, and I talked German to that guy, and he turns around and he said, "Hier is een Russenjongen der kan Deutsch sprechen."
Actually, some officers knew that we were there, but this common soldier did not.
There was a sense of tremendous relief that something had been lifted from us.
Schon aufatmen von dem Druck vom Sowjetregime, sodass wir dachten, jetzt sind wir frei.
We were under the impression Germany was a Christian country.
Die ersten Soldaten, die kamen, die hatten hier und am Koppel Gott mit uns.
This was the old Germany that some of the people still knew from where they had received their German textbooks or their German Bibles and hymn books and other things.
Wir so froh waren, dass wir jetzt wieder frei beten und Andacht haben konnten.
Germans, from their perspective, they view Mennonites as people that they can work with.
VOLKSDEUTSCHE, right? Ethnic Germans, not really German citizens. Slavs were not at the very, very bottom, but at the bottom enough. So they were not treated as decent human beings, right? They were labor and to work for the German masters.
They took Ukrainians out of Ukraine and forced them to labor in Germany for their war effort.
Und da wurden wir sehr gedrillt, als Restdeutsche sollten wir dann Bund deutscher Mädchen und der ganze Drill da.
They wanted to Germanize everything. My name started off as David. David was a Jewish name, and it was not very welcome with the, if I should use the name, Nazis. As a child, I was called by nickname Vitya, and that came close to Victor.
A lot of the Mennonite men, when the war first starts, are serving in the Red Army, and they're serving as Soviet soldiers. Some of them will get captured and will switch sides.
There was no question asked when they said they had to come and serve. And I was too young, but I was big enough to understand what was going on.
Young men that are left in the Mennonite villages, they get snapped up by the German military. They're taken as German translators because of their knowledge of German and Russian.
The whole business of how people under occupation survive is very complex. If you live under military occupation, you still have to stay alive.
We see a variety of responses on the part of Mennonites. Young men joined the local police, as recent scholarship has shown, was involved in local atrocities, particularly against the Jewish population, but also against the Roma population. To Mennonites, watching everything unfold and feeling helpless that they can't help. A sense of sorrow associated with the Jewish population. In some cases, Mennonites had married Jews.
And there was a great disappointment among the adult population, like my mother and others, and they expressed that sometimes. I remember that at one time, an officer who stayed with us said to Mother, "Mrs. Jansen, you can say these things, but for me it would be very dangerous to do so, and you should be careful too." The well-known battle is, of course, of Stalingrad, the famous battle that turned the events of the war.
That then resulted in the evacuation of German-speaking people out of the Ukraine.
We had to leave the whole village.
Mostly women and children decided to go along. They thought they knew what to expect once the Russian front came back into the villages.
There was nobody who wanted to stay.
Germany requisitioned trains to transport people westward. And that included not only Mennonites, but also Lutherans and Catholics, people of German descent.
Packed into a long train of boxcars. We were very fortunate that we could reach West Prussia in 11 days.
The people from the Molochna couldn't get trains anymore. Germany couldn't get trains for them. And they had to go on the Great Trek by horse and wagon.
About 3 months it was on the road and get to Poland.
Hitler intended that that area would become German. That's why he settled German-speaking people there.
We were in camps. Once they won the war, they would use us to settle the empty areas there and so on.
There were big buildings, large rooms, bunk beds, separated from each other for some privacy by blankets, reasonably good food.
That's where I learned my first table grace. That was the first time I ever heard of that, of actually praying.
Deutschland nach Polen, das von den Deutschen eingenommen war, da wurden wir deutsch eingebürgert, von daher habe ich meine deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft, meine deutschen Dokumente.
When I was in Poland, I get a letter from the army. I have 3 days' time to report if not, they would shoot me. They gave you the uniform and then you was there. You know, we had no choice.
And we only got the news that the Russians were expelled here, expelled there.
But we knew that the front was approaching and the Red Army was coming closer, and that we would eventually have to flee.
Generally,
all right, we'll end it there. I know that's pretty heavy stuff that we've been focusing on. One of the things that my history professor at Bethel College often said is look for parallels in history, and that history often swings like a pendulum. And I think you see a lot of parallels to what's going on today. Those photos could have been taken today. This movie, I don't know exactly when it was made, maybe 2018, something like that. So it's the people there are still alive. I want to connect it really quick to our congregation as well. There were several connecting points so far in the story with people in our congregation. First of all, when they said a bunch of Mennonites in the 1870s moved to North America, that's this congregation. And when it said that a bunch moved to the Chaco in Paraguay, that was my story and David's story. In fact, my brother David was born in that town that you saw where those German Mennonites from Germany moved to. They're different than our Kanadier background. You saw the story of those Canadians from Russia, or the Russian Mennonites moving to Canada in the 1920s. That would have been like Val Belknap's background. Her story, how they got to Canada. And then you saw the story, you saw that person tell the story about the rushing water when they blew up the dam. That dam is in Zaporozhye. We have seen pictures of that dam. Aaron has shared pictures of that dam, that hydroelectric dam. It's been blown up several times and rebuilt. His grandmother and other family members worked on that dam as well. So if you feel like you're really disconnected from the story, please don't, because first of all, it's humanity. Second of all, it's very strongly connected to the stories of who we are and why we are where we are. And so when we think of the Israelites stuck with their backs to the Red Sea And to the Egyptian army, and God says, wait, watch, and see. Your job is to be still and then tell the story of what happens. That is our job. Part 2 next Sunday. All right, you can get up, move around, move to where you usually sit in worship service.